Imagine a U.S. carrier strike group, billions of dollars of undisputed maritime supremacy, reduced to mere spectators in the world's most volatile waters. On April 14th, this was not a war game. It was reality. A 250,000-ton Chinese tanker, the Fuxing, sailed right through the U.S. blockade of the Gulf of Oman. No shots fired, no boardings, just deafening silence from the U.S. Abraham Lincoln. How did the ultimate symbol of American hard power become a paper tiger overnight? Welcome to the Lin Directive. I am Lin. And today, we are dissecting the death of a blockade. Picture the Gulf of Oman on the morning of April 14th. The air was thick, not just with the sweltering Middle Eastern humidity, but with the suffocating tension of a global military standoff. The United States had thrown down the gauntlet, drawing a line in the water by enforcing a strict blockade on Iranian ports. To back up this threat, Washington did not just send a diplomatic cable. They deployed the absolute apex predator of the oceans. The U.S. Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group was locked and loaded, flanked by a formidable armada of 16 heavily armed warships. But then, a leviathan appeared on the horizon, the Fuxing. A colossal Chinese tanker sailed directly into the crosshairs. Deep in its hull sat 250,000 tons of methanol. Let us pause and look at the numbers here. Methanol is not just some generic cargo. It is the vital chemical backbone of modern global manufacturing. That single payload represents the raw material for plastics, electronics, and pharmaceuticals, with a downstream economic impact stretching deep into the billions of dollars. Disrupting a shipment of this magnitude would not just be a tactical military interception, it would trigger an economic earthquake across global supply chains. And the Fuxing made absolutely no attempt to hide. They were broadcasting loud and clear on open maritime channels, explicitly confirming their Chinese ownership and their Chinese crew. High above the deck, the 5-star red flag was catching the wind. Historically, the United States Fifth Fleet has a very specific and aggressive playbook for this exact scenario. The standard operating procedure for enforcing a maritime blockade is unforgiving. First comes the stern radio warning on VHF channel 16. Then, the deafening roar of a Seahawk helicopter buzzing the deck. If the vessel refuses to halt, it escalates to a VBSS operation. Visit, board, search and seizure, executed by heavily armed Navy SEALs or Marine Recon units. It is a highly choreographed display of absolute American authority. Wyatt, as the Fuxing charted its course right through the overlapping American defensive perimeters, what did that massive strike group do? Absolutely nothing. The radios remained eerily silent. The helicopters stayed chained to the flight deck. The fleet, in all its billion-dollar glory, simply watched the Chinese vessel sail smoothly past them. In the grand theater of maritime supremacy, the ultimate symbol of American hard power was reduced to nothing more than a $10 billion traffic camera, passively recording a reality it could no longer control. Which brings us to a cold, undeniable truth about the nature of power on the global stage. A red line is only as real as the blood you are willing to spill to defend it. Otherwise, it is just chalk in the rain. So why did the United States stand down? Why did the most lethal military force in human history suddenly suffer a bizarre bout of tactical paralysis? Let us get one thing straight about the bedrock of international maritime law. A flagged merchant vessel is not just a boat floating in the water. It is a mobile, sovereign extension of the nation it represents. The Fuxing is manned by Chinese citizens, owned by a Chinese corporation and sails under the five-star red flag. The exact moment a single American combat boat touches the deck of that tanker, they are no longer just inspecting cargo. They are technically and legally stepping onto Chinese soil. The nature of the game instantly changes from a police action to an act of war. To truly understand Washington's hesitation, we have to look in the rearview mirror. We have to talk about the ghosts of 1993. If you want to know why this moment is so historic, you have to remember the Yinghe incident. 30 years ago, the U.S. Navy tracked, harassed, and practically held hostage a Chinese cargo ship called the Yinghe in international waters for weeks. The U.S. acted on completely flawed intelligence, claiming the ship carried chemical weapons precursors. Why was Washington so brazen, so absolutely ruthless back then? It was simple math. In the early 90s, the entire Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy had a total tonnage that barely registered against the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Beijing lacked a single aircraft carrier, and their most advanced ships were obsolete the day they touched the water. They were a coastal defense force. The United States could board the Yinghe because they knew China's navy could not sail out to stop them. But we are no longer living in the 1990s. The geopolitical tectonic plates have not just shifted, they have been violently reorganized. Over the last decade, China has been launching new state-of-the-art warships at a pace that frustrated Pentagon analysts describe as dumping dumplings into boiling water. We are talking about a historic naval expansion, churning out fleets of Type 055 stealth-guided missile destroyers and putting indigenous carrier strike groups out to sea. But the real nightmare for U.S. planners is not just the ships. It is the impenetrable anti-access and area denial, or a 2AD umbrella. With the mass deployment of the DF-21D and DF-26 hypersonic ballistic missiles, weapons explicitly designed as carrier killers, the operational calculus for the U.S. Navy in the region has fundamentally broken down. The Pentagon War gained a forcible boarding of the Fuxing, and I guarantee you the simulation spit out a geopolitical casualty list they simply could not stomach. For 3 decades, the ghost of the Ying haunted the corridors of Beijing. A phantom of historical humiliation. Today, that phantom has been exorcised and replaced by a titanium-clad Leviathan. The U.S. military understands exactly what they are looking at, which brings us to a harsh, undeniable maxim of geopolitics. Diplomacy without the backing of a blue water navy is just a polite suggestion. In the brutal arithmetic of global power, respect is never negotiated at a conference table. It is forged in the shipyards. But the geopolitical humiliation for Washington did not end with the silent navy. While the United States was busy staring down the Fuxing, a far more dangerous mutiny was brewing right inside its own alliance network. Saudi Arabia, historically America's most lucrative and loyal client state in the Middle East, suddenly flipped the script. Riyadh sent an urgent, almost panicked warning to Washington: stop the blockade and step back from the brink immediately. Why would the Saudis, who inherently despise the Iranian regime, suddenly act as their diplomatic shield? Because Riyadh understands a terrifying strategic reality that Washington is desperately trying to ignore. They are terrified of a classic asymmetrical stratagem, what ancient Chinese strategists called besieging Wei, to rescue Zhao. If the U.S. military actually sparks a kinetic conflict in the Strait of Hormuz, Iran will not just fight a conventional, symmetrical naval war. They will instantly unleash their regional proxy network. Tehran will greenlight the Houthi movement in Yemen to completely choke off the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in the Red Sea. Let us look at the hard data for a second. Saudi Arabia exports roughly 7 million barrels of crude oil every single day. That flow of black gold props up a massive percentage of the entire global energy market. If the Red Sea maritime route dies, the Saudi economy essentially bleeds out. And for the royal family in Riyadh, this is not just theoretical paranoia. We have seen this movie before. Think back to the devastating drone and missile strikes on the Saudi Aramco facilities in Abqaiq. Just a few years ago, over 5 million barrels of daily oil production were knocked offline overnight by cheap, asymmetrical weapons. If Iran is backed into a corner and goes into a full survival mode, utilizing overwhelming swarms of kamikaze drones and precision ballistic missiles, the vital ports, desalination plants, and refineries of the Gulf states will be turned into smoking craters. Washington can order its carrier strike groups to pull up anchor and sail safely back across the Atlantic whenever things get too hot. They can simply walk away from the mess. But Saudi Arabia is geographically locked in. They cannot move their oil fields. Think of the Middle East right now, not as a conventional battlefield, but as a high-stakes, hostage situation inside a fragile glass house. America is standing safely outside, confidently throwing stones, but it is the Saudis who are guaranteed to be shredded by the falling glass. Which brings us to a harsh reality about modern alliances. In the deadly game of proxy warfare, the distant empire can always retreat, but the local stage is always guaranteed to burn. While the House of Saud was busy panicking, Tehran was putting on an absolute masterclass in asymmetrical diplomacy. On April 14th, Iranian officials strategically leaked a highly calculated narrative to the international press. They let it slip that, in order to avoid a catastrophic direct military confrontation, Tehran was actively considering a voluntary temporary suspension of all shipping and crude oil exports through the Strait of Hormuz. The stated objective: to create a peaceful window for diplomatic negotiations. This is what geopolitical strategists call a tactical retreat, designed to launch a devastating strategic offensive. Welcome to the Persian Bazaar. In Washington, diplomacy is often viewed as a rigid, linear contract. But in the ancient political bazaars of Isfahan and Tehran, negotiation is a fluid, multidimensional psychological dance. In this bazaar, threatening to walk away from the table is not the end of the deal. It is the opening move. Let us examine the hard economic data driving this maneuver. Iran knows exactly what haunts the nightmares of Wall Street and the Federal Reserve. It is not a missile strike. It is inflation. Approximately 21 million barrels of oil flow through the choke point of Hormuz every single day. That is roughly 20% of the world's total daily petroleum consumption. Tehran understands that if they voluntarily turn off that tap, global crude prices do not just inch up, they violently spike past $150, maybe even $200 a barrel. We have seen this dynamic fail for the West before, when the US tried its maximum pressure campaign years ago to drive Iranian oil exports to absolute zero. A shadow fleet emerged, and the global market simply absorbed the shock through gray channels. But a sudden, total halt initiated by Iran itself, that inflationary shockwave would immediately shatter Western economies, instantly neutralizing any interest rate policies the Federal Reserve has painstakingly put in place. By offering this peaceful pause, Iran executed a brilliant geopolitical judo throw. They instantly framed themselves as the rational actors, the pragmatic adults in the room, who are willing to make economic sacrifices for the sake of global stability. The psychological and diplomatic pressure immediately rebounded back across the Atlantic. If Washington maintains an aggressive, militarized blockade after Iran has publicly offered a path to de-escalation, the optics change overnight. The United States is no longer seen as the righteous global policeman enforcing international order. They are suddenly painted as the rogue warmongers, recklessly destroying a fragile peace window and deliberately crashing the global economy. Which brings us to a profound law of statecraft. In the high-stakes casino of geopolitics, the ultimate leverage rarely belongs to the player holding the biggest gun. It belongs to the player who makes everyone believe they are perfectly willing to flip the table. Caught in the crushing vice of an allied mutiny, outmaneuvered by Iranian diplomatic judo, and staring down the unstoppable, silent momentum of the Fuxing, the Oval Office finally buckled. The grand illusion of absolute maritime control began to evaporate under the cover of darkness. In a late-night reversal that shocked military analysts, the administration drastically shifted its narrative. The grand, sweeping mandate of blockading the Strait of Hormuz was quietly, awkwardly downgraded to merely blockading Iranian ports. Furthermore, those earlier, fiery threats of destroying ancient Persian cultural sites or launching devastating cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, they vanished completely into the night air, suddenly replaced by a very cautious, very deliberate silence. Why the sudden, humiliating retreat? To understand this, we have to pull back the curtain on the ultimate vulnerability of the American political machine. Domestic survival. We are dealing with a transactional leadership facing the brutal arithmetic of an election year. Let us look at the domestic data driving this panic. If a blockade had triggered a kinetic conflict and oil spiked to $150 a barrel, the average price of gasoline in crucial American swing states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin would have instantly shattered the $5 a gallon mark. Historically, no sitting U.S. president survives an election when the working class is being suffocated by that level of pump-driven inflation. Wall Street knew this too. Internal risk models were already pricing in a massive multi-trillion-dollar equity sell-off if the strait actually closed. Add to this the upcoming diplomatic summits in May and the delicate, high-stakes trade negotiations with Beijing, and Washington realized their geopolitical leverage was completely overextended. Think of this grand American strategy not as an ironclad military doctrine, but as a towering house of cards built on a foundation of bluffing. For decades, the US could win the geopolitical poker game simply because no one ever dared to ask to see their hand. But the moment a true peer competitor, a nation with the industrial capacity, the blue water navy, and the iron will to sail right through the bluff, sat down at the table, the house of cards instantly collapsed. When the Fuxing sailed unhindered through the Gulf of Oman, it did not just deliver a cargo of methanol, it delivered a devastating reality check to Washington: the blockade. Drawn up with so much hubris in the Pentagon. In the face of genuine, uncompromising hard power, it was not an iron curtain. It was just a piece of waste paper drifting in the wind. Which brings us to the ultimate epitaph for this crisis. When a superpower issues an ultimatum, it cannot afford to enforce. It does not just lose a standoff, it loses its empire. The passage of the Fuxing was not just about moving methanol. It was a funeral procession for the unipolar world, when a hegemon draws a red line and a rising power simply sails across it without firing a single bullet. The rules of the global chessboard are rewritten forever. Are we witnessing the dawn of a new maritime order? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Remember, in the face of absolute power, old rules are just empty threats. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.